Ghost of Seaton Hall by Anonymous. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ghost of Seaton Hall by Anonymous. Whatever may be the advantages of progress and civilization, certainly an appreciation of the romantic is not one of them. In these days of railways, steam engines, and Atlantic cables, the marvellous stories which interested our forefathers only provoke ridicule instead of trembling. The reader smiles. Ghosts, haunted castles, and subterraneous passages have long ceased to excite any interest in novel readers, and are almost unknown to modern fiction. The scenes, too, of these supernatural romances, so far as England is concerned, are rapidly becoming disenchanted. The old family mansions, in which this country was once so rich, monuments of medieval darkness, and subjects of many a weird legend, are gradually disappearing. Some have fallen into ruins, and many are being pulled down by their owners to make room for more comfortable modern dwellings. There are still, however, scattered about the country a few genuine old baronial halls, the last relics of feudal times. Within the walls of one of these venerable buildings, a man may imagine himself to be living in the 14th century instead of in the 19th, so entirely different are their internal arrangements and fittings from those of the present day. Some years ago, I happened to be on a short visit to one of these old-fashioned dwellings. The events which happened to me during that visit were so extraordinary that an account of them might almost be mistaken for an extract from The Mysteries of Udolpho. I was engaged at the time in searching for an antiquarian purpose all the old deeds and records I could lay hands on, and a friend had obtained for me permission to look over the valuable muniments relating to the manor of Stanton. I took up my quarters at a very comfortable old inn in a village about 2 miles from Stanton Park. The first day of my visit I devoted to seeing the church and everything of interest in the neighbourhood except the hall. The hall I reserved for the last. The next day, early in the morning, I set out to enjoy one of the greatest antiquarian feasts which the country affords. It was a bright morning, though rather late in the year, and the sun had a splendid effect upon the autumnal hues of the foliage. The entrance to Stanton Park is guarded by 2 low, round towers of stone. These are connected by modern iron gates. Just inside the gates is a lodge, apparently of very modern construction, although much dilapidated, and at that time uninhabited. The park itself bore unmistakable signs of neglect. It is thickly wooded, and, apparently, no attempt had been made to keep down the underwood or lop the trees. Branches that had become rotten and fallen off were left lying on the grass, and now and then appeared the trunks of dead trees. As I was quite unacquainted with the geography of the place, I followed the broad walk as well as I could, for in some places it was difficult to distinguish it from the grass. The gravel had long since disappeared from sight, and was covered with a thick coating of green moss. Dead leaves were lying thickly scattered in all directions. After walking for nearly an hour, I saw the turrets of the hall peeping above the trees. Soon afterwards, I came to an open space, which extended all round the building, and enabled its form and architecture to be seen very plainly. Stanton Hall is one of the finest old buildings in the country. It lies rather low, almost in a valley. Indeed, the whole way from the park gates to the mansion is a gradual descent. Its architecture is of a very mixed kind, and the fabric has the appearance of having been built, or added to, at different periods. About 50 years ago, the building formed a hollow square, but one side of it, fortunately the most modern, was entirely destroyed by fire. The gap caused by the destruction of this side was filled up by an unsightly wall of red brick. This wall very much impairs the general effect of the exterior. It is, moreover, quite useless, for the original outline would have been sufficiently shown by the moat, now dry, which runs round it. At the angles of the building are 3 round towers, the 4th having been burned. Though apparently built at different times, they are all similar in style and are lighted by long, narrow windows and loopholes. The windows of the rest of the building are of various shapes and sizes, and are arranged without any attempt at symmetry. The whole is built of stone, with walls of extraordinary thickness. After walking round the hall several times, and examining it from every point, I made my way very carefully over the drawbridge, for, to say the truth, it was in a very rickety condition. The great gate is flanked by two small towers, or, rather, semicircular projections, with narrow windows and loopholes. Over the gate is a large stone, on which are carved the Stanton arms. Time had defaced them so much that anyone unacquainted with the coat would have been unable to decipher it. After knocking for some time at a small door, cut in the middle of the great gate, I was admitted by a tall, gentlemanly-looking old man into the interior. On telling him my name, and giving my letter of introduction, he was very civil and communicative, and informed me that he was the seneschal. He conducted me at once to the muniment room, which is on the ground floor of one of the corner towers. It is like most rooms used for the purpose of storing old deeds and records, a dark, fireproof den, dimly lighted by 3 narrow windows. There I stayed the rest of the morning and part of the afternoon, turning over heap after heap of ancient parchments, until the short autumnal day had almost come to an end, and it was getting too dark to see. With some difficulty, I made my way back through the intricate passages to the seneschal's room. The old man pressed me to stay and dine with him, saying that it was not often he had company. I urged some faint objections as to getting back in the dark, to which he replied by asking me to remain all night. The truth is, nothing was more to my liking than this offer. I had never slept in an old mansion, except in such as had lost all romantic interest by having been made too comfortable and spoiled by modern furniture. Here was an opportunity of sleeping in an ancient bed, in a room hung with tapestry, with a polished oak floor and carved ceiling, and in a house, moreover, reported to be haunted. Such an opportunity was not to be lost, and, in spite of visions of damp sheets, I joyfully accepted the offer. The seneschal was delighted at the thoughts of having a visitor, and at once set about making the requisite preparations. He was very much perplexed as to what room he should put me in. The red room would not do, because it was so damp. The green room had no hearth for a fire. He ran over the names of a number of other rooms, most of them called after the predominant colour of the furniture, but none seemed quite to suit him. "There's the blue room," said he, "but it's so near the long drawing-room." "Well, what of that?" said I. "Why, the long drawing-room is haunted, and no one has slept near that room for these 10 years. "Oh, if that's the case, I beg you'll let me sleep there. There's nothing I should like better than to sleep in a haunted room." The old man looked horror-struck. "I'm as brave as most men," said he, "but I'd sooner have my hand cut off than be in that room, or anywhere near the long drawing-room after 10 o'clock at night. You surely can't be acquainted with what takes place there." I told him I had heard in the village that the hall was haunted, but no one was able to give me any particulars about it. He promised at dinner to tell me all he knew, saying that, when I had heard what he had to tell, I should give up all thoughts of sleeping in the blue room. I persisted that nothing he could say would alter my desire to sleep in a haunted room, and, at last, by dint of much persuasion, I got him to have the blue room prepared for me. As it wanted about an hour to dinner time, and there was still a little daylight left, we proceeded to make a tour of the hall together. My conductor led me through a labyrinth of passages and rooms, opening one into another. What struck me, as forcibly as anything, was the extraordinary thickness of the walls in certain parts. In one of the towers, the seneschal showed me a secret staircase, leading to a little cell, which had been discovered a few years back. He told me it was supposed that many other such passages must exist in the building, but that the entrances to them had not been brought to light. All the rooms on the drawing-room floor have carved oak ceilings and polished floors. The picture gallery, and most of the rooms in the towers, have stone floors. The 3 finest rooms in the whole building are the banqueting room on the ground floor, the long drawing-room, and the library, the last 2 being on the same floor and opening one into the other. The banqueting room is a magnificent, large, lofty hall, with a stone floor and a roof of massive oak rafters. The walls are hung with shields, banners, and old armour, relieved by huge antlers and buffalo horns. The only furniture in it was a plain oak table at the upper end, and a few large antique chairs placed round an enormous hearth. The chimney-piece is exceedingly handsome, standing about 8 feet high, composed of black marble, grotesquely carved. Over it hangs a portrait of a Stanton, armed cap a pie and on horseback. The long drawing-room, which opens into the library on one side and into a suite of smaller rooms on the other 2 sides, is a magnificent room. The walls are covered with the family portraits for many generations. The furniture is as unlike that of a modern drawing room as can well be imagined. Large, high-backed chairs of dark oak, and covered with crimson velvet, placed here and there about the room, looked as if they had not been touched or sat upon for centuries. There were 2 tables, one at each end of the room, and, at intervals, in niches in the walls, were large carved oak cabinets, some with glass doors, and some covered in and fastened with massive padlocks. The library is only a little smaller than the long drawing room, and furnished in exactly the same manner, except that the walls are covered with books instead of pictures. There are no bookcases, but shelves fitted into recesses in the walls, so that the sides of the room had the appearance of being lined with books. The parts of the walls not so covered are hung with tapestry. By the time that I had examined these rooms, though not so minutely as I would have liked, it grew too dark to see anything more, and soon after we sat down to dinner. The old seneschal had provided a much better repast than I should have obtained at the inn, and altogether made me very comfortable. He was a pleasant, chatty companion, and seemed a man of some education, and almost too good for the position which he held. He told me his history in the course of the evening. He had been bred up in the law, but before he had fully served his time, poverty had compelled him to do something to earn a living, and he was offered, and accepted, the post which he now fills. He told me he had been seneschal of the hall for more than 60 years. I soon found out his weak point, which is a firm belief in ghosts and other supernatural agencies. This weakness did not prevent him from having a considerable regard for the good things of this world. He certainly knew how to make himself comfortable. Under his directions, a large fire of wood and coals was made up on the hearth. The blaze threw a ruddy glow over the whole room, making the tapestry hangings and old furniture look quite cheerful. As soon as the cloth was removed, my host produced a large, curiously carved wooden bowl, in which he proceeded to brew some excellent punch. When this operation was finished, we drew our chairs up to the fire, and the seneschal began to tell the story of the haunted room. "In the first place," said I, "how is it that none of the family live at the hall?" "For 2 reasons," replied the old man. "The first is one that prevents half the world from doing what it would like to do: poverty. If the family were to live here, they must keep up a style equal to that of the other country families round, and the expense of that would be very great, more than the estate can bear. The other reason is because the hall is distasteful to them. Not in itself, they are too wise to prefer any place to the home of their ancestors, but because it has been the scene of many painful events which have taken place within the last 20 years. The old man then proceeded to relate what these events were, but as the reader is not so well acquainted with the history of the family as I was, a short account of it will not be out of place. The Stantons are one of the oldest Norman families in England. They came over with the Conqueror, and were, probably, great men in Normandy long before that time. At the Conquest, they received a large grant of lands in one of the maritime counties, and, by marriage and other means, they now possess about 13 miles of seashore, and the rights belonging to it, rights which are generally vested in the Crown. Stanton Hall stands in the middle of this domain. From the earliest times, and throughout the whole of English history, we find the Stantons marrying into the greatest families of the land, and sometimes with families of the royal blood. But, although thus distinguished, the family has always been without title, except that of knighthood. Lawyers and antiquarians have expressed a confident opinion that the present head of the family might substantiate a title to more than one latent peerage, but the estate, unfortunately, is not in a condition to bear the expense of so tedious an inquiry. The Stantons have always been distinguished for loyalty. During the Great Rebellion, they aided the king to the utmost of their power, which was not small then, and Stanton Hall underwent a long siege by the parliamentary rebels. One of the family even took up his pen in the service of the king, and his controversial pamphlets are among the most interesting relics of the literature of that day. In their zeal for the Stuart family, it is probable that they took part in the various attempts made after the Revolution of 1688 to restore that dynasty. It is certain that since that event the family has been gradually sinking in influence and power. One cause, probably, of this is that mentioned by the seneschal: poverty. Extravagant sons, portions for married daughters, and jointures for widows have sadly encumbered the estate. Alas, mortgages go further towards making an end of old families than all the other causes put together. The seneschal would have told me all these particulars, but when he knew that I was well acquainted with the history of the family, he proceeded to relate the events which, in his opinion, led to the hall becoming haunted. "It is only necessary," said the old man, "to go back to the time of the grandfather of the present owner. It was then that I was appointed seneschal. Aubrey Stanton was my first master here. He was a bad man. He had been a bad boy and a bad youth, and, as he grew older, he became worse. At college, and after he left college, when he married and lived at the Hall, he spent the whole of his time in sporting, gambling, and riotous living. He had only been in possession of the estate for 7 years at his death, and yet, in that short time, he managed to heap upon it more encumbrances than had been effected by 2 generations of his predecessors. He was married to an angel of a wife, one of the most amiable women I have ever seen or heard of. She brought him a large fortune, which he refused to have settled, and, consequently, it was soon squandered. By her he had 3 children: Roger, the father of the present owner, who, as you know, is also called Roger, and 2 daughters. Both the daughters died unmarried. Aubrey Stanton treated his wife very cruelly. Her connections were wealthy, and, as he was always in want of money, he did not scruple to enjoin her to procure it from them. As might be expected, she was not always successful in these humiliating demands, and every refusal on their part was met by her husband with a course of systematic cruelty to herself. I have heard him frequently revile her with the most loathsome language, and not seldom treat her with personal violence. I have seen him spurn her like a dog when she was on her knees, begging forgiveness for some imaginary fault. He little cared who was witness to these passionate outbursts. For some years he continued this treatment, and the poor lady began rapidly to decline in health. When her son was about 15 years old, some secret thought seemed suddenly to reanimate her altogether. She had always been an affectionate mother, but now she was seized with a passionate love for her son. She frequently caressed him with tears in her eyes, saying he was the only object for which she lived. Her health, however, began sensibly to give way. She was naturally of a weak constitution, and the treatment of her husband had had very visible effects. All traces of her former beauty had disappeared. She looked pale, haggard, and miserable. About this time, her uncle, who was reputed to be very rich, suddenly died. Aubrey Stanton had always expected that his wife would get the bulk, if not the whole, of her uncle's property, for she had been a special favourite with him. Much, however, to the astonishment of both, the will did not even mention her name. The effect of this disappointment upon a man like Aubrey can easily be imagined. He raged like a madman. His treatment of his wife grew worse and worse, and I often debated with myself whether common humanity did not compel me to have him bound over to keep the peace. His anger, too, was increased by a suspicion which is now believed to have been well founded. He suspected that, though no mention of his wife had been made in the will, a large provision had been secretly made for her, and that she was, in fact, in possession of a considerable amount of money. The hatred which her uncle bore him tended to strengthen this suspicion, and gave a reason for the silence of the will. Besides this, other circumstances occurred which induced many people to be of the same opinion with Aubrey. I have already mentioned the extraordinary affection which his wife displayed for her son at this time. This affection showed itself not only in caresses, but in somewhat remarkable words. She was heard often to tell her son that, if he were well provided for, she should die happy. Her sole wish, she said, was to leave him some means, however small, wherewith to free the estate from a few of its numerous encumbrances. Expressions of this kind she frequently made use of, and, when her husband's suspicions became generally known, it was thought by many, from these and other events, that they were not without good foundation. For my own part, I am convinced that it was as Aubrey supposed. My reasons for being so certain upon this point will appear as I proceed with my story. Nothing, however, could have been more unfortunate for poor Mrs. Stanton than these suspicions of her husband. Her life before had been one perpetual round of ill-treatment and cruelty. It now became hardly bearable. Day after day, the most painful scenes occurred between Aubrey and herself. He charged her, in no measured terms, with concealing large sums of money from him. It was in vain that, bathed in tears, she persisted in her innocence. Her declarations only increased the fury of his passion and the foulness of his language. It was evident to me that this state of things could not be allowed to continue much longer, and I was reflecting what course to adopt when an important event in this sad tragedy took place. One dreary day in December, a day I shall never forget, I went up into the library to get a book when it was almost dark. As soon as I entered the room, the loud voice of Aubrey proceeding from the long drawing-room, and the sound of weeping, warned me that one of those scenes, then so common, was being enacted by himself and his wife. Aubrey seemed in a more furious state than usual. At first I could not distinctly make out what he said, but I afterwards heard him cry out, "Tell me where you have come from. What have you been doing there? Damn me, I will know if I murder you for it. What have you done with the money, you fiend? Where have you put it? Tell me, I say, do you hear?" Then followed a scuffle and 2 faint screams, and last of all I heard a heavy fall, and then all was still. I rushed into the room, trembling with horror, as a dreadful thought crossed my mind. At the farther end of the room, adjoining the round tower, and by the side of the ancient cabinet, lay Mrs. Stanton, extended lifeless on the ground. Blood was oozing from a wound at the side of her head, which Aubrey, kneeling beside her, was endeavouring to staunch with his handkerchief. He seemed almost beside himself with terror and grief. All signs of anger had entirely passed away, and he was weeping bitterly. He called his wife by the most endearing epithets he could think of, and passionately embraced her senseless body. I at once obtained assistance, and Mrs. Stanton was carried to her room. It was long before we could restore her to life, and then she became quite delirious. As soon as the doctor saw her, he shook his head. The delicate state of health in which she had been for some time past gave him little hopes of her recovery. The actual bodily hurt she had received was very slight, the wound in her head being only skin deep. But the shock to her whole frame was more than her weak state of health could bear. Aubrey was most unremitting in his attentions to her. It was piteous to see his grief. But she never recovered consciousness, and 3 days after, she died. The old man paused when he had uttered the last few words, which were spoken in a faltering voice. "She was the most amiable lady," continued he, with tears in his eyes, "I have ever known, and one of the most beautiful. You may see her portrait in the long drawing-room, by the side of Roger, her son." The fire was now getting low, and as it was the only light in the room, my host rose to make it up. The pile of logs which he threw on the hearth gave out a warmth which was very acceptable, as it was rather a chilly night. Before resuming his seat, he filled both our glasses from the bowl, and desiring me to stand up, we drank "to the memory of Mrs. Stanton." As these words were uttered, I thought I heard a sigh behind me, and I turned round almost involuntarily. "The wind whistles round the old place," said the seneschal, "and finds out all its cracks." I could not help smiling at mistaking the wind for a sigh. The old man then proceeded. Immediately after the death of his wife, Aubrey left the hall, and soon after went abroad. During the short time that he remained in England, his conduct was exemplary. His wife's death seemed to have quite changed and subdued him. But he had not been long from the scene of his disgrace and sorrow before the remembrance of them faded away, and he plunged into even greater excesses than before. His death was worthy of his life. He was picked up in the streets of Rome, with a stiletto through his heart. The history of Roger Stanton, Aubrey's son, is only remarkable in that part of it which relates to the death of his wife and second child. He was as different from his father in temper and character as can well be imagined. His disposition was shy, sombre, and melancholy. The sad events in which he had taken part in his boyhood seemed to have made a lasting impression upon him. He regarded his mother very much as a saint, and the remembrance of her seems never for a moment to have left his heart. He had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. One of the boys died young. The other children are living now. The death of little Chauncey, his second son, was another of the tragic events of which the long drawing-room was the scene, and the ancient cabinet the principal actor. You remember the large iron ring that I pointed out to you, which serves for a handle to the door of the lower part of the cabinet? Little Chauncey was found one day, by his mother, suspended by the neck from this ring, his head being thrust through it. He was quite dead. 2 footstools, one on top of the other, were beside the cabinet, and it was supposed that by means of them he had climbed up to the ring, and while putting his head through it in play, a trick of which it appears he was very fond, had slipped from the stools, and so been accidentally hanged. But this, dreadful as it was not the last scene in which the old cabinet was to take part. By means of it, or at all events in consequence of it, Mrs. Roger Stanton met her death. It may seem strange that a spot where 2 such painful events had taken place was not carefully shunned by the whole family. Certainly, they always spoke and thought of it with horror, and yet they were continually hovering about it. Roger visited the room for the purpose of looking at his mother's portrait, which he would gaze upon for hours, and his wife could not resist frequently visiting the spot where her dear child had met his untimely end. It was probably for this purpose that she went into the room on the day of her death. Her affection for little Chauncey had been very great, and whenever she visited the long drawing-room, she gave way to extravagant expressions of grief. At one moment she would clasp the iron ring and address it with endearing terms as the last thing her dear child had touched. At another moment she would cast it from her as the murderer of her boy. Alas, she had better have left the cursed thing alone. One day, when Roger went into the room to look at his mother's portrait, he saw his wife extended on the floor, with the massive top of the cabinet lying upon her face, her hand being thrust through the ring. I cannot dwell upon the scene which followed. She was quite dead, with her skull fractured in 2 places. Such are the events, sir, which have led the present members of the family to shun the old place, to think of it rather as a charnel house than a home. I often feel inclined to quit it myself, but I am an old man, and have been here more than 60 years. It is one of the oldest buildings, belonging to one of the oldest families which this country can boast, and I cannot bring myself to leave it. But I now come to what you chiefly desired to hear, an account of the haunting of the long drawing-room. And, before I proceed to this, I must beg, sir, that you will hear me with becoming gravity. From what you have already dropped, I gather that you are sceptical as to the possibility of ghostly visitants. When you are my age, and have had my experience, you may, perhaps, change your opinions. Nothing, however, is more disgusting to me than to hear people speak with levity and irreverence of so solemn a subject. I say this, sir, not with any expectation that you will act so, but because I have known people of education and of scrupulous politeness on all other points not hesitate to treat with insolent contempt what I may have chanced to say on this subject. I could hardly help smiling at the serious tone in which the seneschal said these words, and assured him he might rely upon my listening to him with perfect gravity, and begged him to proceed with his story. It was not until after the death of Roger, continued he, that the hall was disturbed by these spiritual visitants. He did not long survive his wife, and the present owner came to the estate when he was only 17 years of age. Young Roger, as he is called here, has never lived at the hall, nor have any of the family since his father's death. They shun the place as much as possible, and if they knew as much about it as I do, they would dislike it still more. I received orders directly after the death of Roger's wife to have the old cabinet destroyed, so hateful had it become in his eyes. When the work was begun, it was found impossible to continue it without considerable damage to the fabric of the tower. The cabinet is built into the solid masonry of the walls and securely bound by massive iron bands. It could not be destroyed without pulling down part of the wall of the tower and so endangering the stability of the whole. It is for this reason only that the cabinet is now in existence. The supernatural appearances with which the hall is haunted are always of the same nature, and occur in the same place, the long drawing-room and the rooms adjacent. These rooms are visited, every now and then, by the ghost of Aubrey Stanton's wife. The ghost goes through the same acts on every appearance with very little alteration, and its dress is that worn by Mrs. Aubrey Stanton in her full-length portrait. She appears in the utmost distress, weeping piteously and wringing her hands. Very frequently words may be distinguished. They are always to the same effect. She seems to be lamenting the loss of some money which she had hidden for the use of her son. The figure generally hovers about the cabinet, feeling all round it, as if to find a secret opening. Sometimes she appears to be struggling with someone, as though pushing him away from something she wants to conceal. The figure often wanders up and down the room, and into the rooms adjoining, of which the blue room is the one most frequented by it. It appears and disappears, always in the same place, by the side of the old cabinet. These facts I have learned partly from personal observation, and partly from what has been told me by the servants. For my own part, I have seen much more than I was at all anxious to see, and I hope never to have any further experiences of the same kind. The sight of unearthly visitors fills me, I confess, with unbearable horror. I would rather meet anything than a ghost. The awestruck manner in which the seneschal said these words had rather a terrifying effect upon me. He was so evidently sincere in what he said that I began to think there must really be more in ghost stories than I had ever admitted. The prospect, too, of passing the night in a room specially favoured by the ghost became much less agreeable than it was in the morning. However, it was too late then to go back, so I inwardly joked off my fear and braced my spirits with more punch. I have now, proceeded the old man, told you everything that will interest you in the history of the family for the last 2 generations. You are now in a position to judge whether the suspicions of Aubrey with regard to his wife's concealment of money were well-founded or not. I have no hesitation myself in saying that they were. Mrs. Stanton's conduct when alive went far towards satisfying me on this point. The appearance of her ghost, and the circumstances attending it, do not leave me any doubt on the subject. It is my belief that, somehow or other, at the time of her uncle's death, she became possessed of a large sum of money, which she intended to keep for her son, that she hid this money in some secret drawer or recess, which she had discovered in the cabinet, and that when she paid her frequent visits to the long drawing-room, it was to see whether the money was safe, and that she was there for that purpose when her husband came into the room, on the day when the events took place which resulted in her death. Whether the money is still there, I cannot tell. I have often carefully examined the cabinet, but I can discover no other opening than the large doors, and the sides of it seem solid in every part. And yet the fact that the ghost hovers about the spot, and always appears and disappears in the same place, would seem to support the assumption that the money lies concealed somewhere near. Perhaps, by observing the ghost, the exact place might be discovered, but this I cannot do. If at any time a large sum of money should be discovered, it will be an immense blessing to the estate, for it is rapidly falling into ruin and decay for want of funds. The old man then brought his story to an end. The melancholy tale had a very depressing effect upon me, and I began, more than ever, to regret my rash request. Once, indeed, I was on the point of asking for another room, but the fear of being laughed at for vain boasting determined me to abide by my choice. The fire had died quite out, and the punch was nearly finished. As it was nearly midnight, I asked to be shown my room, for I was tired with my walk in the morning, and anxious to get through the night. "I shall be glad," said I, "if you will show me the way to my room, for I am afraid I cannot find it by myself." "I shall be very happy," replied the seneschal, "to show you the way in the morning, but I would not go near the long drawing-room now, on any account whatever. Pray do not think me rude. I will call for someone who will have no objection to conduct you to your room." With these words, the seneschal rose, and, opening the door, called for "John!" in a voice loud enough to frighten all the ghosts in the universe. His shout made the old place almost shake, and I could hear the sound traversing the long passages for some seconds after it was uttered. When John made his appearance, I took my leave of the old man, not without some regret at having to part with a companion. As to the seneschal himself, his behaviour was enough to frighten the boldest and most sceptical of men. He shook me warmly by the hand, and, with a faltering voice, commended me to the protection of Providence. Just as I was going with my conductor, he called me back, and whispered in my ear, "There's still time. Do change your mind, and sleep in some other room." I answered that I had quite made up my mind to pass a night with the ghost. The poor old man gave a heavy sigh, and looked after me as though he never expected to see me again. John, who appeared to be a groom, walked rapidly in front of me, with a huge lantern in his hand. The passages seemed much more intricate than in the morning, and we seemed to go through rooms without number. At last we arrived at the blue room. As soon as we were there, John lit my candles, and rushed off at once, without giving me time to say a word to him. He seemed almost as frightened as the seneschal. I could hear his heavy footsteps on the stone floor of the picture gallery, going almost at a run. The room had a very comfortable look. The only fault I could find was that it was too large. The 2 candles did not give a very brilliant light, and, though a good fire was blazing on the hearth, the farther end of the room was quite in shadow. The bed was a very ancient piece of furniture, so high that I was obliged to climb on a chair to get into it. The rest of the furniture was of the same kind, high, stiff-backed carved oak chairs, and 1 or 2 cabinets. There were 2 windows in the room, which showed the walls to be of immense thickness. The entrance to the room was covered with a massive tapestry, there being no door, a fact which annoyed me very much. The bed and windows were also hung with the same material, the principal colour in it being a dark purple blue, which in that light looked almost black. The walls were wainscoted all round to a considerable height with dark oak. Over the wainscot was rough plaster. Having thoroughly surveyed the room, I prepared to go to bed. I took off my boots and coat, and determined not to undress further, in case I should meet with any adventures. Drawing aside the heavy curtains, I looked out of the window, and found, to my surprise, that it was a beautiful moonlit night, the wind having entirely gone down. I looped back the curtains to let in the moonlight, and it being now about 20 minutes to 12, I got into bed. I was very tired, and the fumes of the punch had made me so drowsy that I almost immediately fell asleep, thinking very little about the ghost. I do not know how long I had been asleep, probably only a short time, when I was woke by the sound of weeping. I sat up in bed and rubbed my eyes to make sure that I was really awake. The fire was still bright. The moonlight made the room almost as light as day. I could hear weeping distinctly, but at first I could not make out whence it came. It was a woman's voice, and she appeared in great distress. The sound approached nearer and nearer. In a few minutes, what was my horror to see glide into the room a figure, in every particular the exact counterpart of the portrait of Mrs. Aubrey Stanton, which I had seen in the long drawing-room. It was clothed in a pale lavender dress, very scanty, and made as they were worn at that time. The hair was powdered, and a shawl was fastened crosswise on the breast. The ghost, for such I had now made up my mind it was, wept bitterly, and kept wringing its hands, and making other signs of great sorrow. The figure seemed to glide about the room without touching the floor. I soon ceased to be alarmed at what I saw, but became very much moved at the exhibition of so much grief. I debated with myself whether, in the event of its leaving the room, I should follow it, and made up my mind to do so, though not without some hesitation. I had only just determined what course to pursue, when the figure began to glide out of the room. I at once sprung out of bed, and, taking a light with me, began to follow the figure, having nothing on my feet, so that my steps might be entirely noiseless. The figure still continued weeping as it passed along, but in a much more subdued manner than when it first made its appearance. On reaching the long drawing-room, however, it began to give vent to more passionate expressions of grief than ever. The moon's rays streamed through the windows, lighting up the whole room, and the sight of the mysterious figure standing in the moonlight struck me as very unearthly and ghastly. the ghost began to wander about in an apparent state of distraction, muttering something which I could not distinctly hear. After a little time, it made its way to the old cabinet, and passed its hands rapidly all over it, as though in search of an opening, exactly as the seneschal had described. It seemed, however, to be unsuccessful in its search, and its failure was followed by another burst of grief. The figure threw itself into a chair, and, burying its face in its hands, exclaimed, "Lost! Gone! All gone! Poor Roger! You will be as poor as your father after all! When I thought it so safe, too!" These words were said at intervals, amidst choking sobs, and, when they were ended, the ghost again groped over the cabinet with its hands. At last, to my utter amazement, a panel of the wainscoting near the cabinet flew back, and disclosed a narrow stone staircase, which seemed to wind round the tower. My ghostly companion, as soon as it saw this, gave a scream of delight, and at once began to descend, and, in consequence of the winding of the stairs, was soon out of sight. I looked down, hesitating whether to follow or not. The appearance of the stairs was very uninviting. They were composed, like the sides, of rough blocks of stone, and were covered with moisture. It seemed madness to trust myself, at that time of night, far away from all help, down such a gaping abyss as that. Suppose the sliding panel should slip back? I should be buried alive, with a ghost for a companion. Perhaps, too, it was an oubliette, or a staircase leading to an old well. These thoughts, and many others, rushed through my mind as I stood looking down through the opening. At last I determined to accept the adventure, and run all risks. Before going, however, I took the precaution to place one of the heavy chairs in the aperture, so as to prevent the panel sliding back and shutting me in. Then, taking the candle, I proceeded, carefully, down the steps. They were very steep and slippery, and it was only by leaning against the inner wall that I was able to maintain my footing. I had quite lost sight of the ghost, but after I had wound round and round, for a considerable time, I again saw the figure, floating, apparently in mid-air, and not seeming to touch the steps. Directly after I caught sight of it, the steps came to a sudden termination, ending in a small square den, lined on all sides with rough stones, just such a one as the seneschal pointed out to me in one of the other towers. Here the ghost remained, for a moment or two, perfectly still. It then stooped down, and touched a stone nearest the floor, in one of the corners of the den. Immediately, one of the large flags with which the cell was paved gave way on 3 sides, and, swinging on hinges on the 4th side, discovered another flight of stairs, which the ghost at once proceeded to descend. It was long, however, before I could make up my mind to follow any farther. I had nothing with which to keep the place open. The thought of being shut up in what seemed to be the very bowels of the earth, surrounded on all sides, made me shudder with horror. It would have been bad enough to be shut up where I already was, but in that case I should only be confined by an oak panel, whereas if I was shut in the lower flight of stairs, I should be confined by solid stone. Moreover, as soon as the flag had swung down, the draught of cold air that rushed up from below had almost put out my candle, and I could not help thinking how dreadful my position would be if I were in total darkness. But before giving up the pursuit, I determined to examine the spring which moved the stone. I found, much to my delight, that it was nothing but a common latch, which held the flag firmly when it was fixed in it, but had no influence on its movements when once drawn back. This discovery quite reassured me, and I again proceeded downwards. The second flight of steps was narrower than the first, and the atmosphere much colder. They were also damper and more slippery. Once, indeed, I nearly fell. My progress was very slow, so that, though I was a long time descending, probably the number of steps was not very many. They terminated in the same way as the others, in a small den with walls, floor, and roof of rough stone, and, as before, I did not come in sight of the ghost until it had almost reached the end of the stairs. But its conduct in the lower cell was very different from what it had been in the one above. It seemed to be almost mad with delight, now laughing and now weeping, at one time crying out, "I have found it! I have found it! Roger, dear Roger, will be a rich man after all!" and using other expressions of the same kind. At another time weeping and saying, Still lost, gone forever, stolen by you, you wicked man. Could you not leave me even this? Ah, poor Roger. These and other passionate words were accompanied by most extravagant gestures, sometimes of joy and sometimes of sorrow. At last the ghost became more calm and began sounding the walls in various places, as if to find an opening. I say sounding, but though the figure seemed to be striking them violently with its hands, not a sound could be heard. The walls seemed to be composed of solid masonry, but after a time the ghost paused at a particular stone and pressed it with its hands. The adjoining stone then flew open, disclosing a hollow place in the wall, the contents of which filled me with speechless astonishment. The opening was not large, being simply formed by a removal of one of the blocks of stone from the wall, but, though small, it seemed to be full of treasure. Arranged in 2 rows were about 8 or 10 bags, such as are used by bankers, apparently full of coin. At one side was a tin cash box, fastened by a padlock. I had only time just to get a general glimpse of the contents of this little cupboard, for the thin slab of stone, almost immediately after it had sprung back, resumed its position, and the wall had the same appearance as before. In my eagerness to see what was hidden in the recess, I had quite forgotten the respectful distance at which I had up to that time kept myself from the ghost, and had pushed forward so as almost to look over its shoulder. I was terribly punished for my rashness, for as soon as the opening was again closed, the ghost turned round and fixed its fearful gaze upon me. I was as close to it as I could possibly be, and could see distinctly the livid features, white lips, and glassy eyes of what seemed to be a walking corpse. The sight horrified me beyond measure. My heart seemed to stick in my throat. I could not cry out, and a cold perspiration came all over me. The hideous figure did not move, but, putting a lean finger upon its ashy lips, motioned me to silence. The trial was more than my overstrung nerves could bear, and, dropping the candle, I fell down in a swoon. When I regained my senses, I was almost paralysed with fear, in total darkness, in a secret cell built in the thickness of the wall of the tower, perhaps shut in forever. I thought of the movable stone at the top of the steps. Suppose it was shut down? The hideous form which I had so foolishly followed was able to open it. Why not equally able to shut it? If it were shut, I knew that no human being on my side of it could draw it down. This thought, awful as it was, spurred me to action. I remembered that I had a box of cigar lights in my pocket, and groped about for the candle, in the faint hope of being able to light it by means of them. One after another I struck, but the flame only lasted for a second or two, and the candle wick had become wet by lying on the damp floor of the cell. At last, when my stock was almost exhausted, I succeeded in getting a light. There were no signs of the ghost, nor of the opening in the wall, but I thought I recognised the movable stone. I was too terrified, however, to care to make use of what I had seen, and immediately began to retrace my steps to the upper regions. I found that as difficult a task as it is generally said to be, but after a few minutes' toiling, I arrived at the top of the first flight, and, to my great joy, saw that the aperture was not closed. I did not stop to fasten it, but hastened on, till I came to the top of the upper flight of stairs, and there found the chair thrust half through the opening, just as I had left it. I tottered through the long drawing-room and other rooms as fast as my trembling legs would carry me, till I came to my own room, not daring to look to the right or to the left, lest I should again catch sight of the awful ghost. It will ever be a wonder to me how I managed to find my way, but I seemed, at the time, to wander on almost instinctively. When I reached the blue room, the day was beginning to break. I threw myself on the bed, utterly wearied with terror and excitement, and soon fell asleep. At about 10 o'clock the next morning, I was awoke by the seneschal, who asked me, with an expressive smile, how I had slept. I suppose he read in my looks that something had happened, for I had a violent headache. I did not choose, however, to tell him how much I had been terrified, and when he asked me again how I had slept, I replied, "Very well indeed, but I have been engaged in a much more interesting occupation than sleeping." "What is that?" said he. "Have you seen the ghost?" "Yes," replied I, "and I found it a very avaricious ghost, so avaricious, indeed, that it makes the hall its banker." "What do you mean?" said he, eagerly. "Well, if you will wait till breakfast time, I will tell you all my adventures." This would hardly satisfy the old man, so anxious was he to hear my adventures, but with some difficulty I persuaded him to wait until I was dressed. At breakfast I told him all that I had seen, and everything that had happened, except my fright in the vault. He listened with much less astonishment than I had expected. When I concluded, he rallied me with my incredulity the day before, and improved the occasion by pointing out the evils of a sceptical disposition. He said that he had no doubt whatever that the stairs and vaults which I had seen were in the thickness of the wall of the tower, and that, if the entrance to them could only be discovered, the treasure would be found. After some discussion as to the best way of proceeding, he came to the determination immediately after breakfast to explore the cells. I was delighted at this resolve, and urged him to get someone to assist us, but this he refused to do, saying that the affair had better be confined to ourselves. I was too much excited to eat much breakfast, and we soon set out on our expedition. The seneschal provided himself with a lantern, and I took a heavy poker. When we approached the old cabinet, I could not help trembling when I thought of what I had seen there the night before, and every moment expected to see the ghost appear, although it was broad daylight. The seneschal, however, was wonderful brave. The effect the daylight had upon his nerves was quite marvellous, but my fears soon subsided when I saw, standing in its proper place, some little distance from the cabinet, the large chair which I had left the night before thrust half through the opening. No opening was now to be seen, and everything looked the same as when the seneschal first showed me the room. I began to think that, after all, I had only had a dream, and though I felt rather vexed at having been so taken in, I was glad to get back my former scepticism. This discovery threw rather a damp upon the seneschal, for he expected to find the opening already made for him. But he at once set about feeling all over the sides of the cabinet in the manner in which I described the ghost to have done. After continuing this operation some time, suddenly, to my surprise, the panel flew back, and discovered the identical stairs which I had descended with the ghost. In a moment, my scepticism again vanished, and I became a firm believer in ghosts. The seneschal was almost out of his mind with joy. He jumped about and clapped his hands like a child. When we had secured the opening with a chair, in the same way as I had done before, we began to descend the steps. The seneschal, who was, as I thought, bold almost to rashness, went first, showing a light with his lantern. When we arrived at the first cell, I noticed that the flagstone which I had left open the night before was fastened. I was very much astonished as to how this could have been done, and could only account for it by attributing it to the ghost. We managed, however, without any difficulty, to find the spring, and, unfastening the stone, again descended. When we reached the second cell, I remembered how I had dropped the candle the night before, and had thrown down several matches. I looked about, but could discover no trace of the matches, and not a spot of grease was to be seen anywhere. This, again, troubled me a good deal, and I could only account for it in the same way as I had accounted for the other difficulties. But as soon as the seneschal had thrown a light on the walls, I at once recognised the movable stone, and pounced upon it for fear I should lose it. We were both of us very much excited, and, with trembling hands, eagerly tried to move the stone or discover the spring. But we were unsuccessful. For at least half an hour we tried every means we could think of to make it open, and even tried other parts of the wall in case I had made a mistake in the exact spot. But it was all to no purpose. The stone did not budge an inch, and the whole wall sounded as solid as a rock. This apparently fruitless end of our labours was very disappointing. We thought ourselves on the verge of some great discovery, and, after all, it was nothing. My ghost experiences were useless, and I had suffered the most dreadful fright to no purpose. Sorrowfully gathering up our tools, we prepared to reascend. The seneschal turned round to give one last look at the stone, saying, with a sound something between a growl and a sigh, "Obstinate brute! Why can't you move?" He then struck the stone a heavy blow with his fist, when lo! The slab flew back, and disclosed the treasure for which we had been seeking. There lay everything exactly as I had seen it the night before, the yellow bags in 2 rows, and the tin box on one side. The seneschal at once cried out to me to put my poker in the recess to prevent the treacherous stone from closing up again. He then hastily took out everything, cramming the bags into his pockets, and putting the box under his arms, as though afraid to trust them to the floor in case they should be swallowed up. As soon as we reached the upper regions, and had made everything secure, a messenger was sent off to telegraph for the solicitor of the family that the treasure might be examined in his presence. He did not make his appearance until late in the evening, and the agony of curiosity which we suffered in the meantime is not to be described. The bags were opened first. There were 7 of them, and they weighed very heavy. The seneschal and myself had been trying all the afternoon to discover by the touch what were their contents, and we had come to the conclusion that they contained jewels. This conjecture proved to be right. All but one were filled with ladies' ornamental jewellery of very great value. One bag was entirely filled with an enormous diamond necklace. The only bag which did not contain jewels was filled with ancient coins, most of them English and Saxon. The value of that single bag, from an antiquarian point of view, was more than that of all the others together. The tin box, when it was first opened, seemed to contain nothing but paper, but this paper proved to be banknotes to the amount of £8,000. They were crisp and clean, as though they had only just come from the bankers. Underneath the notes was a quantity of jewellery. I was afterwards told that the jewels were valued at over £40,000, so that the whole sum which we discovered amounted to £48,000. Such was the result of my adventures with the ghost in Stanton Hall, a result much more substantial than generally comes from such interviews. Whether, indeed, it was a ghost which I saw and followed, or whether the whole was not a dream from beginning to end, I will not attempt to determine. Some people to whom I have told this story maintain that it was nothing more than a nightmare, brought about by the dismal story of the seneschal. His tale, they say, had filled my mind with all the materials for such a dream, and the favourable circumstances in which I was placed, all alone, at midnight, in a remote corner of an ancient hall, in a room reported to be haunted, were only likely to make me dream that I had experienced what he had described. The fact, too, of the chair which I had placed in the aperture being in its proper place in the morning, and the flagstone being shut, although I had left it open, are in themselves, say they, sufficient to support this conclusion. All this seems very plausible, but still I feel very unwilling to accept the explanation. The seneschal indignantly scouts it, and becomes a firmer believer in ghosts every day of his life. For my own part, I am not very anxious to solve the mystery. I only know that, by means of a ghost, or by means of a dream, whichever you please, I discovered the Stanton estate to be £48,000 richer than it was thought to be. Still, I have such a vivid recollection of all that happened on that night, and such a clear remembrance of the fearful look of the ghost, that I can hardly believe that these impressions were made in a dream. But, whatever may be the true explanation, I know that for the future I shall always speak very respectfully of ghosts, and never again pass the night in a haunted room. As soon as young Roger Stanton heard of this unexpected increase of his income, he took up his abode at Stanton Hall. He's lately been married to a very beautiful girl, and I hope he will have more happiness than his 2 immediate predecessors. There is still one point that remains unexplained, the manner in which the treasure became secreted in the cell. Whether it was put there by Mrs. Stanton, or by whom, has not yet been ascertained with certainty. Steps are being taken to clear up this point by means of the banknotes, and probably this course will be successful. The friends of Mrs. Stanton's uncle, who was supposed to have left her some money, can give no explanation of the matter, and none of his papers have any reference whatever to his niece, so far, at least, as pecuniary matters are concerned. I often visit my old friend the seneschal. He tells me that the ghost has never been seen since the discovery of the treasure, and the old hall has had a more cheerful appearance ever since. Last time I was at the hall, I went into the long drawing-room to look at the picture of Mrs. Aubrey Stanton, and it seemed to me that the expression of her face was quite changed. When first I saw the portrait, the features had a look of the deepest sorrow. They are now lit up with a smile.
Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web.
David H.
Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.